Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Let's get after it.
Gurdjieff and his team successfully transformed frog embryos to salamander embryos simply by transmitting the DNA information pattern through frequency alone. Gurdjieff's research group proved that with this method, chromosomes damaged by X-rays, for example, can be repaired. They even captured information patterns of a particular DNA and transmitted it to another, thus reprogramming cells to another genome. So they successfully transformed, for example, frog embryos into salamander embryos simply by transmitting the DNA information patterns. According to Russian researchers, our DNA is not only responsible for the construction of our body, but also serves as data storage and communication. The Russian linguists found that the genetic code, especially in the useless 90%, follows the same rules as all our human languages.
So this right here actually makes me think back to the pyramids and the potential that they were some sort of a frequency generating device. This could be what the Anunnaki built and used to manipulate our DNA using frequencies. Maybe DNA manipulation was done using frequencies. If we're discovering that that's a thing now, they would have known about it back then, being much more advanced than we are now. It's just an interesting thought, though. It is fascinating to see that you can manipulate DNA just using sound frequencies. The more I learn about sound frequency, the more I think they're the magical answer to the universe.
There's what they call Omicron configuration, where the craft is using one generator, or Delta configuration, where it's utilizing all three. Delta configuration would be for space travel. Essentially, the craft would tilt up on its side, focus the three gravity generators to a single point, and move through space that way. And as opposed to what we're used to, for instance, a plane, once it's in the air, we envision thrust or some force coming out the back of it to push it forward. The crafts work completely opposite of that. Is once they're hovering in the air, they'll swing the two remaining gravity generators up in front of them and create a distortion, essentially a downhill, and the craft rolls downhill for infinity. It's why they look goofy when they fly around at low speed. The gravity field around the Earth is not completely constant and stable, depending on the minerals and density of the Earth underneath it. So its low speed mode is kind of unstable for the most part.
I don't think it's necessarily that it's manipulating gravity, but that it's manipulating our electromagnetic field. I think that makes a lot more sense. I think Bob Lazar is fascinating because his story hasn't changed, and you see how old that interview is, and he's got a new interview within the last 2 years where he was on Joe Rogan's podcast and essentially says, not essentially, but literally gives the exact same explanation. The guy's story's never deviated once, so I've said it once, I'll say it again. The guy could give a master class on how to keep your story straight. Hey, if you're enjoying this video, I make a new one just like it every single day. It'd be awesome if you'd hit that subscribe button and come back tomorrow to join me.
So if you haven't heard by now, deep sea explorers may have found Amelia Earhart's long-lost plane. According to her final radio messages with the U.S. Coast Guard vessel stationed nearby, all contact with Earhart ceased on July 2nd after 8:43 a.m. And that is supposedly the last anyone has ever heard from her. Until the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, or TGAR, published a paper in 2018 that strongly refutes this, stating that they have ample evidence to show that Earhart sent out radio distress messages for several days after July 2nd. After Earhart disappeared, the U.S. Navy put out an all ships, all stations bulletin. Authorities asked anyone with a radio and a trained ear to tune in to the radio frequencies that Earhart was using on her trip. And this was not as simple as it sounds. So the people who heard Earhart's distress messages just happened to be listening to the radio at the right time. And one of those people was a 15-year-old girl listening in from St. Petersburg, Florida, who transcribed some of the desperate phrases she heard. Quote, "Water's high, water's knee deep. Let me out. Help us quick." A housewife in Toronto heard a shorter message. Quote, "We have taken in water. We can't hold on much longer." On July 3rd, a woman named Nina Paxton from Ashland, Kentucky, said she heard Earhart say, quote, "KHAQQ calling," and that she was on or near a little island at a point near, and then it cuts out. Then she says something about a storm and that the wind was blowing. "We will have to get out of here. We can't stay here long." What happened to Amelia Earhart after that has vexed the world for nearly 87 years. TIGAR is just one group of researchers who have dedicated their time and resources to solving one of aviation's greatest mysteries. So here's what they discovered. So they conducted an extensive analysis of more than 2,000 Coast Guard and US Navy log entries and tracked down 57 credible post-loss radio messages reported in the days after Earhart's disappearance to construct a picture of what may have happened in those final days. Based on the quality of the radio messages, TIGAR deduced that the point of origin of these radio messages were coming from Gardner Island, because the quality of radio reception decreased the farther you moved away from Gardner Island. And only at Baker Island, which is the station closest to Gardner, did an operator hear a strong, clear voice signal with the plane's call sign, KHAQQ. And if you notice, the island just above Baker is Howland Island. That is the island that Earhart and Noonan were supposed to land at to refuel and never arrived. And eerily enough, Earhart's very last radio message to the U.S. Coast Guard vessel at 8:43 a.m. was her stating that she was on the line, position 157-337, running north and south. And what island happens to be on this line of position is Nukumaro Island, also known as Gardner Island. So TIGAR deduced that Earhart and Noonan had to basically crash land on Gardner Island and were marooned on the reef. And the reason TIGAR believed this is absolutely bonkers nutso science. I mean that in a good way. Okay, if the plane was stuck on the reef at Gardner Island, then that presented Earhart with a problem. The plane's radio relied on the aircraft's batteries, but you need the batteries to start the engine. So if they kept the radio on and continued to send distress messages, then they would run out of the battery and they wouldn't be able to start the plane. But here's the rub. The timing of the distress messages are strange. TIGAR believed that there was a pattern to them that was oddly specific, as if Earhart was only sending distress messages when the tide was out. So TIGAR hypothesized that the plane was halfway underwater, and thus Earhart could only send messages when the water level was low enough for the propeller tip to clear. Because again, she needed to turn the engine on to send the radio message. In other words, TIGAR concluded that Earhart and Noonan had to stick to a certain schedule based on the tide. They're seeking shelter, shade, and food during the day, and then they head back to the plane during low tide to try the radio message again. To test their hypothesis, TIGAR compared past tidal levels and reef height data from Gardner Reef to the post-loss signals on an hour-by-hour timeline. And in their words, the correlation was astounding. Every credible transmission only occurred when the water level was low enough for the propeller to clear. But there's even more to the story. TIGAR didn't just randomly start this investigation based solely on the post-lost radio messages. In 1940, bones were discovered on Gardner Island, which was originally believed to have belonged to Earhart, but then were, quote, misidentified and discarded. So TIGAR built this body of evidence on top of forensic anthropologist Dr. Richard Yancey's paper in 2018, which reanalyzed the bone evidence using modern-day techniques. These bones on Gardner Island were found by a British expedition team who stumbled upon a skull, other skeletal parts, and the remains of what looked like a woman's shoe. Among these bones was a box that held a Brandis Navy surveying sextant made in 1918 and a bottle of Benedictine, an herbal liqueur. I wanted to do a little bit of digging to see if Benedictine was even popular in the 1930s when Earhart was alive. And I found out that Benedictine was one of the most popular cocktails in 1930s New York during the Prohibition. And Amelia Earhart lived in New York for a while. She went to Columbia University, and then after graduating, she continued to live there for a few years because her husband owned a publishing company there. So it's totally possible that she packed the Benedictine as part of her belongings for the flight. Anyways, the 13 bones were shipped to Fiji and were studied by D.W. Hoodless, who determined that the skeleton was a man and the bones were subsequently chucked. But since the bones are gone, Yance co-developed a computer program that can estimate sex and ancestry by using skeletal measurements, called Fordisk. Yance compared the lengths of the bones to Earhart's measurements using her height, weight, body build, limb lengths, and proportions from both photographs and information found on her pilot's and driver's licenses. The Fordisk analysis not only found the bones were female, that Earhart's bones were, quote, more similar to the Gardner bones than 99% of individuals in a large reference sample. So in his paper, Dr. Yance says that the only documented person to whom these Gardner bones could belong to is Amelia Earhart. Although doing a proper DNA analysis on the actual bones would give us the clearest and most definitive answer, The 4-disc analysis comes pretty darn close. This, coupled with the TGAR's radio message analysis, paints a pretty compelling yet distressing picture. One can only imagine what was going through her mind in those final moments.
Man, just imagine that. Her and this guy that she was with were putting out this distress signal every day, thinking, all right, we're going to put out this distress signal. Someone's going to hear it and they're going to come save us. And not only did we not pick up on the distress signal in a speedy enough manner to be of some assistance, but it took us nearly 100 years to pinpoint where the signal was coming from. Even if they had survived out there, and they would have died of old age before we found them. But that's pretty fascinating. I feel like it's a case closed on Amelia Earhart. That's evidence enough to me. That's overwhelming evidence. I do feel like they finally solved the case.
Did we talk about Area 51 with a little coffin? So Dr. Michael Heiser, I think.
Heiser.
He was talking about the Roswell incident, and he said that after World War II, U.S. government basically brought on all these scientists from Germany, like these scientists. Coincidentally, the Roswell incident happened the year after all these scientists came over. One thing that was super weird was, what's the guy that makes coffee?
Yeah. Mortician. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was a mortician.
Yeah.
He was asked to bring 2 child caskets to the crash site. Me and Andy were like, that's weird. I mean, because you're thinking of like little aliens or whatever. Why would you put them in a casket? Heiser's, he said that these would usually perform experiments and have children be like test pilots for these things.
No.
Typically it was like kids in like foster care. They're untraceable. And so it would make sense using children in this vehicle, and it crashes and they
It's horrible.
perish. Then they're like, it's probably aliens. So if the U.S. population knew that we had scientists in the U.S. working with the U.S. and
Foster kids.
using children for experiments, game over.
What
you
else
know?
did we expect? These?
Heard this before, these tiny coffins being used to bury aliens in. But the theory that they're actually burying children who were trying to pilot these crafts makes a lot more sense. The only thing that doesn't make sense is how would the federal government trust a child to control the craft and stay where they tell them to go? You're talking about someone, I would say, around the age of 8. Traditionally, in my experience, 8-year-olds are not that great at taking advice, not that great at following direction.
Mount Hermon.
Oh,
The Book of Enoch, 200 angels, watchers, descended upon the top of Mount Hermon. But this man, Sir Charles Warren, he like was the chief of police for like London or something. He wanted to go to the Israel-Palestine area and map it out. And he made it to Mount Hermon. And he said there was this giant ancient temple, this spiral thing. And he said at the center, it appeared to be like an altar for sacrifices. But up there also was this giant stone tablet with these carvings and writings on it. They brought it back to England, but then the British Museum put it in the archives. No one is allowed to go and do research on it.
Wow.
But today, at the peak of Mount Hermon, is a UN lookout post kind of thing. If you're not high ranking, you cannot go up there. They have banned any archaeological digs, anything around that area.
Not
Oh,
cool.
man.
Not cool.
What's
Terrible.
crazy too is some biblical scholars theorize that the transfiguration of Jesus also happened at the top of Mount Hermon. If the watchers descended upon this place, is there like a weird portal?
It's certainly a place where that veil is thinner.
Yeah.
that's crazy to think about.
I knew about the story of Mount Hermon, and I'm currently reading through the Book of Enoch right now and trying to learn more about all that. But it's interesting to me to find out that they've got some structure up there that, once again, we're not allowed to go up there. We're not allowed to do any archaeological digs in the area. We're not allowed to go up there and explore. It's another Antarctica. It's fascinating, all these places that seem to have great mythological tales that surround them, and the government sees them as highly important locations that we can't go to. Kind of makes you wonder, maybe those aren't myths. Maybe there's some validity to it.
CERN is the largest machine in the world, and you can go to their website and you'll see their symbol has 3 6s, 666. And on their website it says, what is the nature of our universe? What is it made of? This machine accelerates particles at the speed of light. Many believe when these particles collide, they create miniature black holes. Many spiritual people believe that when these black holes open, they're able to observe matter in a different dimension, and that whatever's living on that side might be able to get through to this side. Could you imagine if hypothetically the CERN machine is able to open up into, portals to other dimensions. We know that there's other dimensions. This is a fact of science. You don't even have to believe in God. Every scientist says, yes, there are more dimensions than the one we can see and smell and touch. Like, we live in 3. There's maybe up to 11, maybe even more dimensions than that. These demonic beings have lived in a parallel dimension to ours. They're on this earth. They have cities. Some of the scholars in Islam believe the demonic realm, the throne of the devil, is above water. They don't know if it's the Bermuda Triangle or the Devil's Sea, but in the parallel dimension, that is where their throne, his throne, sits. So imagine now the demonic realm is on this earth, but in a parallel dimension. Imagine if they can get into this dimension and they still have their powers and they're able to shapeshift. We know in the religion that these demons follow us our whole lives. They know how they can mimic us. They can talk. Could you imagine if they get through into this world and you see your dead grandfather from 30 years ago and they're telling you there is no God. We've cured death. No one will ever die again. Look, we brought your grandfather back, but it's not your grandfather. It's a demon acting like him. I'm not saying you'll see that for certain, but it's one of my theories. We know these beings can shapeshift. They can travel at the speed of light. They live in a parallel dimension. They can influence thought, and they have brought much innovation to humanity with the human beings that have sold their souls for black magic, for knowledge. They've done rituals, and this is why they have an obsession with Solomon, the Temple of Solomon, and why I think we are getting closer.
Most disconcerting part of that whole speech there is that CERN's logo is 666. I wasn't aware of that. I knew they were doing some shady crap, but man, talk about just being bold-faced about it. Yeah, all the rest of what that guy's saying, I don't know where he's putting all this stuff together from, how he's putting these pieces together. It's a lot of it's stuff I've heard before. Some of the pieces sound like his own theory, but there's no way for anyone to back up any of this stuff and show any real evidence or proof for it. Unfortunately, I can't help but see it as all hogwash, but I guess we'll find out if I'm wrong and that guy's correct shortly, because things really seem to be popping off. If something's going to happen, it's going to happen soon. Feels like, anyway.
The Smithson family and the history of the Smithsonian Institute is something that we could never talk too much about. There's just incredible underground storage vaults in the Smithsonian Institute where they it's like I call it informational Area 51, where things that aren't quite fitting the normal pattern of what people want or told they need to know about are hidden away. One of the big things is this underground cavern system was uncovered in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Now let me just say that the archaeological history that we've been fed as we go through the public school system is so ludicrous, really. The Grand Canyon was actually not a small river carving it through millions of years. The fact is, with the Uinta Basin, all the inland ocean that was all part of that, something cataclysmic happened, fracturing of the rock around the time of 30 AD that caused a massive amount of water to go out over a short period of time and carve the Grand Canyon out. I want to say that there's plenty of evidence of that happening. It's somebody say it's revisionist history or an alternative reality, but no, it's just archaeologically and completely. And if you look at geography, it makes all the sense in the world if you look at topographical maps. Okay, so that said, we see the beginning of this in when Major Powell did his first expedition down the Grand Canyon. Everybody thought he was crazy as a loon. You know, there's this one-armed major was lost his arm in the Civil War, coming down in the 1870s after the conclusion of the Civil War to basically map this great river. They thought he would never make it out. If you look at the Powell Museum there in Page, Arizona, there's little boats and they go over the cataracts and the massive amount of water. It was an amazing feat to come down. But He survived, as we know. He had a Native American Navajo guide that basically took him down, not expecting to even know if he'd survived the trip. It was a massive leap of faith, really. So they explained this is in the congressional record, because Powell wrote everything in his report to Congress, and he explains what he found looking up at this cave, which was quite a ways up from where the river was flowing in 1870s. And as the explanation went, he went up into it, was able to rock climb up to there's like a keyhole opening that was not natural. It was absolutely carved. And he went in and was shocked with what they found in there. Absolutely Egyptian artifacts galore inside. So he didn't have time, of course, to do a full-scale excavation, but in his report to Congress, he made mention of it. Well, that, of course, garnered the attention of the Smithson family, and the Smithsonian Institute sponsored a second trip through, this time loaded with photography equipment, to document what was in there. This was a few years after the initial expedition. And so the Smithsonian Institute went in there and, my goodness, took all kinds of pictures. And instead of going on down the river, they actually hiked up to the top of the rim and went overland from there to map that out. Okay, that's part of the unknown history of the early expeditions of the Grand Canyon. So we fast forward from the 1870s, when this information became public. It was kind of, the end of the 1800s, the early 1900s. The world goes to war, right? We have the Great War. At the conclusion of the Great War, a guy named G.E. Kincaid, who is an employee of the Smithsonian Institute, he's survives the Great War, comes in, and he's funded by Smithsonian to go back in and look for that lost cavern system. So Kincaid does that, goes in under the disguise of mineral exploration, prospecting, okay, and he locates the exact same Powell cave, goes in with his photography equipment, and brings out a massive amount of precious metal artifacts. Comes up over the top. He's so excited about what he's found, he makes a press release, and the local newspapers all front page headlines: amazing find in the Grand Canyon. News articles on my blog, which was all from, again, the Smithsonian Institute. Well, my blog was shut down and erased, actually, in December of 2019, okay? But that particular blog post, Terry, got tens of thousands of hits. It was a lightning rod. A lot of people, oh wow, this is fantastic information, Doc. I just post them. So the question that people ask me is, where'd you get these pictures? Well, I had he's now deceased, so I can talk about him now. A friend named Dr. Melvin Laney in Washington, D.C. had high-level security clearance, and he had full unfettered access to the Smithsonian's archives. He sent me this information tied into what I'm working in the property here in Utah. Another story for another time, but it tied in, most definitely ties in, this story of G.E. Kincaid and the amazing discoveries at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. PowerPoint presentation to people who want to come and see this. I think it's interesting.
Smithsonian says, no, it never did happen, but you got into the actual archives. You got actual documentation.
And it's an amazing, jaw-dropping story. Let me just give you some hints of what we're going to be showing. Massive amounts of mummies. And the big thing is, Terry, is there were thousands and thousands of panels of Egyptian hieroglyphics that have been interpreted. And what it tells the story of should rewrite all the world's history, frankly.
Huh.
Because it's none other than the biblical Joseph of Egypt and his history.
Wow.
Yeah, big time wow. It's exciting. And, well, even religionists are saying, well, that's a real stretch. Well, why? It proves the Bible and the story in Genesis of Joseph to be true. The coat of many colors being sold into Egypt. It answers the question, really. It was more than just a deal with Potiphar's wife that elevated Joseph to be the most powerful vizier, and second only to the Pharaoh himself. It tells the story of how he ascended to, and why he was able to bring all the grains and survive the famines that went on. It's all in the history of this cave in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It's an amazing story.
I thought that you guys would enjoy that clip as much as I did. This guy claims to have proof that the Smithsonian has these archives that they're hiding all this stuff from and knowledge of what's in it, and claims to have some documentation that he's going to share showing some of these things that they found in the Grand Canyon that the Smithsonian's been hiding for all these years. I am going to try to locate the rest of this clip where he actually divulges some of this stuff and shows some of these things, and have that in a future video. But yeah, I just thought that was fascinating. And his question that he proposed there towards the end of why would they not want to show this stuff because it would prove the Bible. He answered his own question, that they don't want to prove that there's a God and that there's anyone in charge of anything other than men.
I literally do not understand how this is not mainstream household information. Like, every time I review this information, like, my mind is just blown over and over again. Just watch.
Here's another interesting scientific fact. The heart is an electrical organ, producing by far the strongest source of rhythmic bioelectricity. This energy goes to every cell in your body. Your heart produces enough electrical energy to create a magnetic field surrounding your body in 360 degrees, extending beyond the skin out into space, measurable about 3 feet outside your body.
So the moral of the story is our heart radiates out. Like, this is why our culture constantly, naturally, intuitively refers to having good vibes and bad vibes. We already can feel this sixth sense. Like, literally, electromagnetically, all our hearts are talking to one another. We are immersed in a 360 spherical bubble in each other's heart bubbles all the time. So it matters whether you're in a negative or a positive state of being, because this literally creates your interaction with reality, with people, with events. This is work done by HeartMath. They are a non-profit that has been doing this since 1991, for 30 years. It is time we start really giving energy to this, giving understanding to this, and like implementing this into our world. We need it now more than ever.
This is just me talking crazy, but would it be our magnetic field that's created from our heart interacting with the magnetic field of the earth that keeps us here instead of gravity? Are we being held here because we're specifically designed to be able to maintain our position here and not float away because of the way our bodies are designed? All life has some electrical current running through it. Does everything have some sort of electrical magnetic field that surrounds it, that keeps it in place? Is this the direction that Newton should have been looking instead of dropping apples off of trees? That's probably not how it worked. I'm the one that thought of the idea, so it probably doesn't work that way. But I just think it's interesting to think about. So we found out in this video today that you can manipulate your DNA using sound frequencies, and that we have a literal electromagnetic aura going around our bodies at all times. Pretty fascinating stuff. Guys, I'm going to go ahead and call the video there. I will be jumping in the Discord tonight, and I'm sorry I didn't get in there much last night. I had some issues with copyright stuff that I had to fix in order to get the video up, which put us late getting out to dinner, and then blah, 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 blah. Ended up not having enough time to do everything that I wanted to do yesterday evening. But I hope you guys enjoyed these clips. I will be back tomorrow with another video. Have a great, safe, fantastic Saturday. I will see you tomorrow.